A customer service agent receives a refund request. Before the system processes the transaction, 3 enforcement checks fire in 47 milliseconds. Authority verification. Does this agent have the scope to issue refunds? Admissibility evaluation. Is this the refund amount within the approved limits under current policy? Evidence capture. Cryptographic seal of the decision state at bind. All 3 pass. The refund processes. The customer sees a 4-second resolution. The enforcement layer fires 3 times before the action was completed. That is the execution boundary working as designed. Not policy documents saying agents can issue refunds. Not logs reconstructing decisions after the fact. Real-time proof that the system verified the authority before acting. When boards ask who authorized this action before the consequence occurred, the answer exists because enforcement happened at bind time, not after problems emerged. This is where authority must resolve. Governance, Part 15. How enforcement at bind time prevents consequence without control. Section 1. What the execution boundary actually is. The execution boundary is the architectural control point where proposed actions are evaluated for authority and admissibility before they bind to consequence, not after, not during incident review, before the action commits. This concept comes directly from security engineering. Code commits require review before merging production. Database transactions verify authorization before writing. API calls validate credentials before executing. Deployment pipelines check compliance before releasing. Those patterns exist because systems that enforce after problems cost more than the systems that prevent problems from occurring. AI inference workflows require the same discipline applied to the decision commit point. An agent proposes an action. The execution boundary evaluates whether that action should proceed. 3 questions resolve: authority, admissibility, evidence. The outcome is deterministic: allow, escalate, or refuse. Allow means all checks passed and action proceeds immediately. Escalate means uncertainty exists and human judgment is required. Refuse means check failed and action is blocked entirely. No middle ground, no probability, fine, no check the logs later. The boundary resolved at bind time and a consequence followed only when authorized. Section 2. Authority before execution. Authority verification answers whether the system proposing an action has been granted scope to perform that action, not whether the action is a good idea, not whether the outcome will be beneficial, whether the system has the right to act at all. A procurement agent requests authorization to place a supply order. The execution boundary requires the authority registry. What scope was this agent granted? The registry returns that procurement has authority up to $50,000 per transaction. Vendor relationships with approved suppliers only. Commodity categories excluding capital equipment. The proposed order is $32,000 with an approved supplier. For operational materials, authority checks pass. The agent has scope to perform this action. If the order were $60,000, authority check fails. The agent lacks scope for transactions above $50,000. If the supplier were not on the approved list, authority check fails. If the commodity category were capital equipment, authority checks fails. In all 3 failure cases, the boundary refuses or escalates rather than allowing action to proceed beyond granted authority. Authority is not static. Delegation chains matter. If Agent A delegates task to Agent B operates under the intersection of its own granted authority and the authority Agent A had available to delegate. If Agent A had authority to commit up to $100,000 but delegated a task scoped at $20,000, Agent B cannot exceed $20,000 even if its own authority ceiling is higher. Time bounds matter. Authority can expire. An agent granted temporary elevated privileges for a specific operational window loses that authority when the window closes. The execution boundary evaluates authority state at bind time, not at the moment authority was originally granted. Section 3. Admissibility at bind. Admissibility evaluation answers whether the proposed action should be allowed under current policy even when authority exists. Authority says the system can act. Admissibility says the system should act given present conditions. A procurement agent has authority for the $32,000 order. Admissibility evaluation queries operational governance memory. How many orders has this agent placed this quarter? What were the consequence patterns? The memory returns there were 15 recent orders, which is a 12% average overage against projected demand. Inventory carrying costs rising. Policy defines admissibility thresholds. Orders within authority that fall into pattern categories flagged by operational memory triggers escalation even when individual transactions appear routine. This order is unremarkable. This order, as part of accumulating pattern, requires human review. Admissibility is not rules evaluation. Rules are static. Admissibility is dynamic policy resolution against current state. Same action, different admissibility outcome based on execution history, operational context, and real-time conditions that policy written months ago could not anticipate. A customer service agent issues a refund. Authority exists. Admissibility queries fraud detection systems. Is this customer account flagged? Has this account requested multiple refunds recently? Are refund requests clustering in suspicious patterns? All checks clear. Admissibility passes. The refund proceeds. Next week, the same agent issues another refund to a different customer. Authority still exists, but admissibility evaluation now shows his agent has issued refunds 30% above historical baseline in the last 7 days. Admissibility triggers escalation, not because individual refunds exceeded limits, because aggregate patterns suggest investigation before additional refunds proceed. The execution boundary evaluates admissibility at bind time using current state, not historical assumptions. This is where governance memory connects to enforcement. Past execution creates context that shapes whether similar future actions remain admissible without escalation. Section 4. Evidence sealed at bind. Evidence capture at the executionary boundary creates cryptographic proof of the decision state of the moment action was authorized or refused, not logs written afterwards. Not explanations reconstructed from incomplete records. Immutable evidence sealed when the boundary resolved. The procurement agent order reaches the execution boundary. Authority verification runs. Scope checks passed. Agent identifier granted authority sealing. Commodity restrictions. Timestamp of verification. Cryptographically sealed. Admissibility evaluation runs. Operational memory queue pattern analysis. Threshold comparisons. Escalation decision. Cryptographically sealed. The complete decision context exists as temper-evident artifact before action commits. If the order proceeds, evidence proves authority and admissibility were verified. If regulators ask whether appropriate controls existed, the sealed evidence answers. If audit asks whether the system should have escalated, the admissibility evaluation shows what factors were considered and why the decision resolved to allow. If order is refused, evidence proves why. Authority check failed at this specific point. Admissibility evaluation triggered this threshold. The system did not act because enforcement prevented it. Post-instant analysis does not reconstruct what probably happened. Evidence shows what actually happened at bind time. Evidence sealing is not optional logging. It is a governance of operational byproduct. Every executional boundary resolution generates proof automatically. The organization does not document governance after the fact. The architecture produces evidence as systems operate. Section 5. The 3-outcome resolution model. Every execution boundary evaluation resolves to one of 3 outcomes: allow, escalate, or refuse. No ambiguity, no probably fine, deterministic resolution before consequence occurs. Allow means all checks passed, authority verified, admissibility confirmed, evidence sealed. Action produces immediately without human intervention. The system acts within granted scope under conditions where policy permits autonomous operation. This is the green light. Consequence followed because controlled verified authorization first. Escalate means uncertainty exists. Authority may be borderline. Admissibility may require judgment. Context may suggest risk that automated evolution cannot resolve confidently. The proposed action routes to human review, not because the system failed, because the boundary correctly identified situations where human judgment adds value. The system does not guess, it escalates. Refuse means checks failed. Authority does not exist for this action. Admissibility evaluation determined this action should not proceed under any circumstances. The boundary blocks execution entirely. No escalation option, no override without explicit authority modification. The system does not act because enforcement prevented unauthorized consequence. The 3 outcomes create organizational clarity. Systems that reach allow have proven their right to act. Systems that escalate have correctly identified judgment calls. Systems that encounter refuse have been stopped before creating exposure. Accountability exists at bind time, not reconstructed after investigation. Section 6. Binding execution boundary into inference workflows. The execution boundary is not a separate review step bolted onto finished systems. It is an architectural integration at the commitment point where inference decisions become actions with consequence. An LLM inference pipeline reprocesses a query. Retrieval returns context. The model generates a response. Before that response routes to the user or triggers downstream action, the execution boundary fires. Does this response fall within granted scope of this agent? Is this response admissible given the query context and operational memory? Should this response proceed or require review? If the response is factual information retrieved with no operational impact, the boundary typically allows. If the response includes recommendations that trigger financial transactions, the boundary evaluates whether those transactions fall within authority and admissibility thresholds. If the response appears to contain sensitive data that query context does not justify accessing, the boundary refuses or escalates. The boundary layers into existing infrastructure, not a replacement for RAG pipelines, model serving, or API gateways. An additional control layer at the point where intelligence converts to action. The inference workflow you build at the model series operates unchanged. The execution boundary adds enforcement without breaking existing functionality. This is the discipline security engineering teaches. Defense in depth, multiple control layers, enforcement at commit time. Fail-safe design where systems default to refusing rather than allowing when boundary evaluation encounters errors or ambiguity. The execution boundary applies those patterns to autonomous AI systems at the moment decisions bind to reality.